Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. In these selections of King Arthur and his knights, you will learn about how Merlin built the Round Table, where King Arthur received the amazing sword Excalibur, and how he met and fell in love with the beautiful and charming Guinevere. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. King Arthur and his Knights. The Table Round. As long as Uther, Arthur's father, lived, Merlin the great wizard was always his best friend. The stories told about the magician's fairy house in the woods were quite true, and Merlin spent some of his time in his wonderful home among the pine trees, looking from one or another of the 70 windows, or passing in and out of one or another of the 60 doors. What a strange, shadowy place it was, to be sure, with wild deer feeding in the glades that surrounded it, and wild geese clanging as they flew in great flocks across the sky at night. Human beings never ventured very far into this mysterious wood, but they whispered many strange tales about it to one another as they sat over their big log fires in the evenings. They named it the Enchanted Forest, or sometimes the Valley of No Return. Hunters who followed the hares over the meadows, or chased the wild boars through the tangled thickets on the edge of the woodland, always stopped short and turned their horses and their hounds about when they looked into the dark shadows of these haunted trees. Sometimes they caught glimpses of gray, dim walls and towers, and heard sounds like fairies singing, or unseen horses trampling, or invisible hounds baying through the wood. Then the real horses and hounds would begin to tremble as the hunters hurried them away. But nobody could ever quite describe what he had seen and heard, though all were agreed that if any rash person ventured up to the dim gray walls of Merlin's home, something dreadful would happen to them. In this hidden house, then, Merlin learned many and varied things from the fairies, because he could see and hear and speak to the invisible people of the air. He learned so many of their secrets that at last he became a real fairy king among them. Not only would the wild stags carry him wherever he wanted to go, but all the good fairy folk would come out of the streams and down from the stars whenever he called them. One day, Merlin was standing under a great oak tree, just after the sun had set, and the quiet shadows had commenced to steal through his beautiful wood. The little birds had stopped singing, and the bats were beginning to flit about. Merlin felt that something very wonderful was going to happen, something beautiful and strange, by which even the fairy folk of the enchanted forest would be greatly amazed. The evening grew darker, and presently the oak boughs above his head began to rustle and whisper, as if a little wind were wafting them up and down. At the same time, he heard gentle tappings inside the tree trunk, and a murmur of many voices speaking together in what to him seemed to be an unknown foreign tongue. Then, in the middle of the shadows, the branches and trunk of the oak began to give out a silver light, like the shining of a full moon. Slowly and silently, the silvery light grew round about the tree. The boughs seemed to fade away, and a wonderful picture, as though it were painted on the silvery mist, appeared. The picture of an old man with a long white beard, standing before a silver table, on which was set a mysterious and beautiful shining cup. Round about the table were seated many people who wore bright Eastern robes and looked very calm and happy. And by the side of the old man with the white beard stood a younger man with a silver fish in his hands. He placed the fish on the table and all stood up. Merlin thought he heard them singing as they did so, but the music was very faint and seemed to come from very far away. Then the whole bright vision faded, the silver table and the shining cup and the gaily dressed people disappeared, and Merlin found himself alone in the forest again, with the oak leaves whispering and rustling above his head. But while he stood wondering, behold! A little book suddenly fell down from the branches close to his feet. As it fell, he heard a gentle voice speaking softly among the leaves of the tree. "In the little book is written the story of the silver table and the shining cup that you have been allowed to see in a vision. I who speak to you am the old druid who saw them brought to the land of West over the sea. I have been commanded to show you the vision and to give you the little book. Also, I have been commanded to tell you that from the wood of the oak tree in whose boughs you have seen the vision, you are to carve another round table, like the silver table, on which the shining cup stood. When you have carved this second round table, you are to take it to King Uther and bid him keep it carefully in his palace until his death, for it will have a marvelous meaning and purpose for many years to come." The voice died away, and even Merlin, magician though he was, could not see the spirit of the old druid, which had visited him in the enchanted forest and brought the little old mysterious book. But he picked up the book and took it home to his fairy house. There he lit his lamp, and sitting down among his magic volumes and crystals and strange caskets and boxes, he read the book from end to end, and in it was the whole story of Joseph and his followers, and the church made of wood at Glastonbury, and the beautiful Christmas flowering thorn. Not only was the whole tale written down in the book, but there were also careful directions about the making of the second round table, which was to be carved from the oak in whose branches Merlin had seen the vision, and when finished, given into the care of Uther the king. Merlin locked the book up carefully in one of his caskets, for he knew what a very, very precious possession it was. Many years afterward, the little book fell into the hands of another good old man, who was very much like the long-dead Glastonbury druid himself. It came to him just as it came to Merlin, falling from the boughs of a tree that was lit up with mysterious light, while a voice spoke softly among the rustling leaves. And, so people would have told you in those days, it was through the writing in the little old book that they knew all about the silver table and the rich fisher and the hidden secrets of the Holy Grail. Meanwhile, however, Merlin kept the little book locked up and set to work to make a huge round table from the oak tree in the wood. Nobody knows exactly how he made it, but the fairy folk helped him, and he found words written in the little book that were obeyed by invisible hands, using invisible saws and axes and hammers and nails. When he had finished, he was an even greater magician than he had been when he had begun. So great that by using certain spells, he was able to lift the round table out of his house in the enchanted forest and to set it down in the very middle of the great hall of the royal castle that belonged to Uther the king. Uther was greatly amazed when he saw this beautiful round table, brought to his castle nobody knew how. As he gazed at it, however, he became aware that Merlin was standing by him, smiling at his astonishment. The great magician told him something of the way the mystic table had been built, But he darkly hinted in words the king did not wholly understand that in another day the table should be a symbol of the greatness of the reign of Uther's son. And so indeed it happened, for when Arthur became king, all the great knights who fought his battles gathered at the Table Round. Here they told the tales of the great deeds that cleared the bandits from the waste places and made safe the land. Here they that were all of one mind with him were given their tasks to change the old wicked order into the new. Here they renewed the vows of that great day when they sang before the king, "Blow trumpet, for the world is white with May. Blow trumpet, the long night hath rolled away. Blow through the living world, let the king reign. Strike for the king and live. His knights have heard that God hath told the king a secret word. Fall battle-axe and flash brand, let the king reign. The king will follow Christ, and we the king, in whom high God hath breathed a secret thing. Fall battle-axe and clash brand, let the king reign." The sword Excalibur. It soon became known all over Britain, after Arthur had drawn the sword from the stone, that the only son of Uther Pendragon had been found at last. Though some of the barons were very angry, and refused at first to accept the beardless boy, as they called him, they saw that they were wrong when the beautiful Queen Igeerne openly declared him to be the child of the dead king and herself. So Arthur was crowned with great rejoicings and feastings, and, as he sat on his throne, the assembled warriors cried out that he was in truth their king, and that they would always faithfully serve him. Then Arthur, in low, deep tones and simple words of great authority, bound them by so strait vows to his own self, that when they rose, knighted from kneeling, some were pale as the passing of a ghost, some flushed, and others dazed, as one who wakes half-blinded at the coming of a light. Very soon after he had become king, Arthur heard of many wrongs that had been done since the death of his father. He heard of lands that had been taken from their rightful owners, and of many people who had been ill-treated in one way and another. So having determined to be known as a great and good king, Arthur's first deed was to see that the lands were returned and the evildoers punished. Never was there so handsome and so favored a young sovereign. Not only did all the knights and the ladies of his court have the greatest affection for him, but the fairies of the forests and lakes loved him too. Had he not been given into the special care of Merlin, that master of magic, who knew 100 times as many secrets as the fairies knew themselves? Arthur's sister, too, was half a fairy, and was called Morgane la Fay, which means Morgan, the fairy maiden. She knew all sorts of spells, both good and bad, and could have told, though she never did, what sorts of words to use if you wanted to get inside mountains, or down to the bottom of deep lakes, and how to get out of such places again, which, on the whole, was almost more important than how to get in. She could read stories in the stars, and tell you the wonderful enchantments that might, any moonlit night, be woven by means of a hazel wand, held in a certain very secret manner. She knew exactly what kind of fern seed would make you invisible, and where to find the flowers that were used for wonderful wine that smelled like primroses and wild honey, and made you fall head over heels in love. There was no end to Morgane le Fay's magic, for indeed she was only a few degrees less clever than Merlin the wizard himself. Arthur and his sister were very fond of each other, though, like a good many other brothers and sisters, they quarreled a little sometimes. It is, however, almost certain that Morgan had something to do with the way in which the young king came into possession of a second sword, much more marvelous than the one which, before he was known as Uther's son, he had pulled out of the shining white stone at Christmas time in the churchyard to give to his brother Sir Kay. Not very far from Arthur's castle, which was at a place called Caerleon, some distance from Tintagel, there stood a large, densely shaded forest of tall pines and broad oaks. In the middle of the wood was a fountain, which was always full of clear spring water. By the fountain a beautiful tent appeared one day, hung inside with satin curtains and decorated with tassels of silver and gold. Just outside the tent, a horse in bright, rich trappings was tethered, and on a bough over the horse's head hung a magnificent shield, set thickly with jewels and enameled in all the colors of a peacock's tail. As soon as this lovely tent and horse and shield appeared by the side of the fountain, all the passers-by knew the meaning of their coming. Some strange and powerful knight from a distant country had taken up his post in the middle of one of King Arthur's private forests, and was challenging anybody and everybody to come and turn him out. This was a thing that happened very often in those days, and there was never any lack of knights to answer the challenge. In fact, the whole court was generally delighted to hear of such a stranger. It meant honor and glory to every knight who rode out to give the intruder battle, and great distinction to the one who succeeded in conquering him and bringing him a prisoner to the throne of the king. The first person to come tell Arthur about the knight who had set up this beautiful tent by the fountain was a very brave youth called Griflet, who was only a page at the court of Caerleon. He begged the king to give him the order of knighthood, that he might ride off at once to the forest and fight with the stranger, who, he said eagerly, was one of the strongest, bravest, cleverest knights in the whole world. Arthur hesitated, for he thought Griflet was too inexperienced and young. But Merlin told him to do as the lad asked. So the king made him a knight, as he begged, and, calling him Sir Griflet for the first time, made him promise to come back to the court if he failed in the brave deed he was so anxious to perform. Sir Griflet promised and rode off. But in a few hours he came riding back again, terribly wounded and dreadfully unhappy and disappointed. The knight by the fountain had easily conquered him, and had thrown both him and his horse to the ground. But, instead of killing him then and there, the stranger had himself dismounted and given aid to poor Sir Griflet, telling him he was a brave youngster, and would make a fine fighter when he was a little older. Then he had set the young knight on his horse again, and sent him back to the king. When King Arthur heard Sir Griflet's story, he exclaimed that the stranger was indeed a fine and generous knight, and that he would himself go to the forest and challenge him to battle. For in those days, the more splendid and brave an enemy was, the more honor there was in fighting him, even as it is today. So off rode King Arthur on a magnificent war-horse, his shield and sword and breastplate shining, with his Lord Chamberlain mounted on another fine horse, trotting a little way behind. On the way, Merlin joined them, and walked by the king's stirrup, saying he thought he might be wanted before the day was over. As he and Arthur talked together, they came in sight of the richly colored tent with the strange knight, dressed in all his bright armor, standing by the side of the tree where his shield was hanging, its jewels and enamel gleaming in the shade of the boughs. When he saw another knight riding in the forest, he stepped forward and stood very proud and erect, barring the way that led onward through the wood. "How now?" cried Arthur. "Then no one may pass this way without a fight?" "That is so," answered the knight. in a bold and haughty manner. "Are you ready?" "Quite ready," replied Arthur joyfully. "Mount your horse, and we will see which of us is the better knight." So the stranger leaped upon his horse, and with sword and spear, king and knight sprang toward each other to do battle. Such a crash rang through the forest as they met. If you heard it today, you would think some dreadful accident had happened. But the crash was only the noise of the king's spear striking the shield of the knight, and the knight's spear striking the shield of the king. And so vigorously did each strike that both the spears were shivered into 1,000 pieces. Then the Lord Chamberlain rode up with 2 new unbroken spears, and the 2 brave warriors met again with even a louder crash than before. Again, each spear was shattered to bits. By this time both king and knight were hot with battle, and springing from their horses, they rushed at each other on foot, brandishing their sharp, shining swords. Over and over again they struck, one at the other, each trying to strike the conquering blow. At last the stranger knight drew back for a moment, and King Arthur, thinking he was exhausted, leaped toward him. But the other swung his sword suddenly high above his head, and brought it with all his force against the king's sword as Arthur made his spring. So violent was the knight's great blow that it cut right through the sword of the king, who was left with only the jagged handle in his grasp. Then Arthur threw away the handle and rushed at the knight with his mailed gloves. So they fought again, rocking and swaying together like 2 mighty wrestlers. But at last King Arthur was thrown to the ground and lay senseless among the bruised ferns and crushed wildflowers of the forest floor. The stranger knight lifted high his own unbroken sword. Whether or not to strike the fainting king, none ever knew. For Merlin, who had been watching, sprang forward and waved his wizard's wand. The knight slipped slowly to the ground and lay beside the king in a deep sleep, while Merlin lifted Arthur and set him, only half conscious, on the stranger's horse. The king, pale and exhausted, looked down on the knight as Merlin led the horse away. "Oh, Merlin, Merlin," he cried, "you have killed the finest knight that ever did battle against a king." "Not so," answered Merlin. "He is only asleep, and it is a good thing for you that he is not awake. But come, you must have another sword to make up for the one that has been broken in the fight." So on they went through the trees, Merlin still leading the horse. Presently they came to a big open space in the forest, and there in the afternoon sunlight glimmered the wide waters of a mysterious lake. Nothing was in sight, no cottages, no castle, no people, no wild foxes or deer. But out in the middle of the lake, a white hand and arm were stretched out from the water, as motionless as if they were carved in ivory. A long sleeve of pearly satin was folded about the arm, and the slender hand held the most beautiful jeweled sword that Arthur had ever seen. As the king looked, amazed, he saw a golden-haired fairy maiden in a silver gown, walking on the green water, just as a pretty girl might trip across a green meadow. She came stepping daintily toward him, and Arthur asked Merlin who she was. "She is Nimue, the Lady of the Lake," said Merlin, "and if you ask her very courteously, she will tell you how to get the sword." So when the Lady of the Lake set her pretty little foot on the shore, Arthur went toward her, and bowing very low, asked her to tell him how he might get the sword. Then the maiden smiled and showed him a fairy barge, snugly hidden among the reeds and rushes. She told him he had but to get into the barge, row himself into the middle of the lake, and take the sword out of the fair white hand which held it. And, as my reward for telling you this, said she, one day I shall come to the court and claim a favor from you. Then she disappeared, and Arthur and Merlin, springing into the barge, rowed out into the middle of the lake as fast as they could. All this time, the hand and arm that held the sword had remained quite still. How strange they looked, rising so mysteriously from the quiet, glimmering water. How Arthur marveled as he drew nearer and nearer at the slim wrist and the delicate fingers of that white, strange hand. What lady or fairy could it be who lived under the waves of that wonderful mirror and was offering this beautiful jeweled gift to a human king? The barge drew close up to the motionless arm, and Arthur, leaning over the side, put out his hand. Very gently and carefully he drew the shining sword from the fairy fingers. As soon as he touched the sword, they released their clasp, and the arm sank slowly, slowly down into the lake. The ripples closed over it with a little murmur, and it was gone. And Arthur, when he examined the sword, saw that on one side of the blade the words, "Take me," were engraved, and that on the other side appeared the legend, "Cast me away." When he had read these words, he became very sad. But Merlin said, "Take the sword and make good use of it, for the time when you will have to cast it away is very far off." Then Merlin rowed the barge back again to the rocky, reedy bank of the lake. The lady who had told them to take the sword was nowhere to be seen. She had disappeared entirely, and had left not so much as a glimmer of her silver gown or a gleam of her golden hair among the dark pines that grew close down to the water's edge. Arthur and Merlin stepped out of the barge, and Arthur fastened the fairy sword to his side. Then Merlin, who had read all about it in one of his fairy books, told him that the sword was called Excalibur, and that it was just as precious and wonderful as the round table itself. The wizard told the king, too, the name of the stranger knight, which was Pellinore, and said that he also was a great king. But when Arthur wanted to go and finish the battle with Pellinore, now that he was armed with a fairy sword, Merlin said that he had fought quite enough for one day. So he and the king rode back to Caerleon, with Excalibur hanging by Arthur's side, while King Pellinore awoke quietly from his enchanted sleep, and went to rest in his tent, hung with silken curtains and golden tassels, that he had set up by the side of the fern-fringed fountain in the shade of the forest trees. Guinevere. King Leodogran, as you know, was an old friend of King Uther Pendragon, who had given into his charge Merlin's wonderful round table, where seats could be found for 250 knights. This round table was kept in the banqueting hall of Leodogran's big stone castle at Cameliard. All the knights who feasted there were under a vow, and the words of this vow were some of the noblest words that have ever been spoken in the history of the world. Besides the round table, Leodogran's castle held another great treasure, his only daughter, Guinevere, the most beautiful and most gracious maiden in the whole wide earth. Guinevere flitted about the castle almost like a fairy princess. So golden was her hair, so blue were her eyes, so peach-pink her delicately rounded cheeks. Sometimes she sang to herself softly in the great hall. Sometimes she sat in her bedroom window doing embroidery. Sometimes she went to and fro among her maidens, overseeing them as they spun linen thread upon their pretty spinning wheels, or wove the same thread into shining damask on their dainty looms. When her father's step was heard on the flags of the stone floors, Guinevere would lay everything aside and hasten to meet him. If he were tired and battle-worn, as often indeed she found him, she would bring him cool, clear water in a silver basin, place his hands in it, and dry them herself with a fine towel, before offering him a crystal goblet brimming with red wine to drink. Leodogran would gladly have died in the defense of his daughter Guinevere, though he was silent and almost cold to her, and sometimes even very strict and stern. One morning the King of Cameliard, who had been away for some days, came galloping back to the castle on his war-horse, and cried to the servants to let down the portcullis, or the great entrance door, to raise the bridge over the moat, and to prepare for a siege. His enemies were riding in hundreds over the surrounding hills. The knights of the Round Table came hurrying into the great hall, their pages running after them to buckle on their master's armor as fast as they could. But instead of a page, Leodogran was waited upon by his own daughter, the Princess Guinevere, who brought him his helmet, breastplate, sword, and shield. Praying to heaven to protect him, she watched the king ride out of the courtyard at the head of his noble knights. Then she herself looked after the preparations for the siege of the castle, before running lightly up the winding stone stairs. She took up her stand by the window of a high tower, from which she could watch the battle. What a clash of armies she saw outside! What waving of banners, galloping and rearing of horses, cries of triumph or despair! Here, there, and everywhere flashed Leodogran in his bright armor, supported always by the knights of the Round Table. For long they held their own, but by and by Princess Guinevere, gazing always from the window, felt her heart shaken with sudden fear. She saw the knights pressed hard on every side by an army stronger in numbers than themselves. They fought fiercely and magnificently, but they were being driven back toward the castle walls. Would they be able to drive away these eager and terrible regiments of foes, or would they be forced to yield and give Cameliard into the hands of the enemy? Princess Guinevere tried hard to keep up a good heart, but when the tide of battle seemed to have turned against her father, the numbness of dismay seized her. Then, suddenly, she heard a shout of encouragement and triumph. Down among her father's foes came riding an unknown knight, the noblest in bearing, most beautiful in face, and brightest in armor that the princess had ever seen. Above his head floated a banner which displayed a dragon wrought in burnished gold. In his hand flashed a sword of gleaming steel, its handle studded with diamonds, rubies, and pearls. Who was he, and whence could he have come? Guinevere leaned far out of the casement, joyful and reassured, for the tide of battle immediately turned. In and out, backward and forward, glittered the golden sign of the dragon, while the strange knight's sword swept through the enemy like an avenging flame. Whoever was touched by this sword, however lightly, fell from his horse to the ground. Its owner seemed to be everywhere at once. He had slain hundreds of Leodogran's enemies when, as if he had dropped from the sky, an old man appeared at his side, seized the bridle, and threw his war-horse back upon its haunches. "Enough!" cried this old man, who had come from no one knew where. "Enough! Do you not see that the battle is won? The whole enemy army is in flight." Then the stranger knight paused and saw indeed a confused mass of men and horses riding fast for the distant hills. He bowed his head and slowly slid his sword into its sheath. Then up rode King Leodogran, grim, blood-stained, and weary, and bent low in his saddle to the young brave stranger who saved his castle and all that was in it.
"Beautiful and courageous knight," said Leodogran, "how can I thank you? Come, follow me into my castle. I do not know who you are, but you have saved my home for me, and anything or everything in it is yours for the asking."
The knight also bent low in his saddle, for the knights of those days were always very dignified and very courteous. Then the big portcullis was raised again, and the bridge lowered over the moat. 2 and 2, kings and knights, they all rode into the courtyard of the castle, and the clatter of the horses' feet reached Princess Guinevere as she came hurrying down from the window of the high tower. How busy everybody in the castle was, to be sure. Pages with big baskets on their arms were strewing the floors with bright fresh rushes, mingled with wild flowers. Cooks in the kitchen were roasting and stewing and baking with all their might. Delighted, smiling maidens were pouring cool scented water into basins, taking clean white towels out of the presses, and bringing soft, rich robes into the big hall, ready to lay on the knight's shoulders when the pages had taken off the stained and heavy armor in which these brave gentlemen had fought. King Leodogran led the stranger knight to the seat of honor and bade him rest. As the tired soldier sank down upon a couch all clean and fresh, with piles of sweet-smelling rushes, he saw a lovely lady coming quickly forward from among the serving maidens who were waiting on the Knights of the Round Table. To the stranger knight, she seemed like a beautiful picture as she came forward, cautiously bearing a silver basin and snow-white towel, while a truant ray of sunlight lay on her golden headdress and dainty silken gown. It was the Princess Guinevere, hastening to wait courteously and lovingly on her father the king. But, as she curtsied deeply to him, he waved her from him and pointed to his guest, who was watching eagerly from his couch of green rushes.
"Wait first on the stranger knight," said Leodogran. "Had it not been for his help, the castle of Cameliard would have fallen."
So Guinevere turned from her father to the stranger knight, and the moment the eyes of the knight and the maiden met, the two fell in love. How wonderful it seemed to both! The soldier in his armor looked adoringly at the sweet face under the golden headdress, the long hair no less golden, which fell in 2 plaits to the very hem of this fair lady's gown. Guinevere, for her part, hardly lifted her shy blue eyes from the ground as she helped the stranger take off his breastplate, laid a rich satin cloak on his shoulders, offered him the water and the towel, and called to a servant to bring a refreshing drink. The old man, who had entered the castle with the knights, smiled as he watched them, and drawing near to Leodogran, pointed out the pretty sight.
"You offered anything your castle held to your deliverer," said he. "I think I know what gift your visitor will be asking soon."
King Leodogran started and looked rather dismayed.
"Who is he?" he asked. "And who, old man, are you?"
The king stared very closely at his unknown visitor, who only shook his head.
No matter," said he. "But what of your promise to give the knight anything he asks?" "My promise shall be kept," said Leodogran proudly, and the old man smiled again as he stepped away.
Then everyone in the hall began to move toward the banqueting room, and the 250 knights took their places at the round table, which was spread for a feast. King Leodogran stood watching them, and the stranger knight stepped forward and joined him, looking at him very earnestly indeed.
"Good and great king," said he, "I am from a distant court, and do not know your customs here. What is this round table, and who are these knights who have taken their places about it?"
Leodogran answered gravely.
"Brave stranger," he said, "that round table was left in my charge by a great king, Uther Pendragon himself." Whoever takes his place at it must share in a noble vow. Will you sit among my 250 knights? Will you join in the words of the vow?"
The knight's face had become very bright and eager when he heard the name of Uther Pendragon. He looked to the right and saw the old man's eyes fixed earnestly upon him. He glanced to the left and met the shy, gentle gaze of beautiful Guinevere. Then he made a quick step forward and took his seat at the table among the 250 knights.
"Will you admit me to your fellowship?" he cried in a piercing voice. "Will you let me hear and share the words of your vow?"
Then as one, the 250 knights sprang to their feet, and 250 voices rang out lustily in the great vow: "To right the wrong, to punish the guilty, to feed the hungry, to help the feeble, to obey the law, and never to turn away from a woman in distress. This is the high and solemn vow of the Knights of the Round Table." The sound of voices ceased, and everyone turned to the stranger who had drawn his sword and was holding it on high. Word for word he repeated the vow in a ringing voice, then thrust his sword back into the scabbard, looking with his whole heart in his eyes at Princess Guinevere. Leodogran stepped forward and held up his hand for silence.
"Sir Knight," he said, "who are you?"
With a triumphant smile, the stranger answered him,
"I am Arthur, King of Britain, and proud so to be, but far, far prouder to have become a Knight of the Round Table."
He paused for a moment, then moved swiftly forward and knelt on one knee before Guinevere as he finished speaking.
"And proudest of all, King Leodogran, to put my sword, my spear, my life at the service of this fair and gentle lady."
Then the old man came forward, and King Leodogran knew him to be Merlin, the great magician. Merlin, glancing toward Arthur, took Guinevere's hand and laid it on her father's palm. Leodogran, with a smile, placed it in Arthur's ready clasp, and raising him to his feet, bent very low before him.
"My liege and lord," said he, "I would have given my daughter gladly to the knight who saved Cameliard. How much more joyfully I give her to Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon, King of Britain, and Knight of the Round Table."
This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to stories of King Arthur and his knights. If you enjoy this podcast, please send an email to kluker@marshallpl.org to tell me of your favorite stories. I'll talk to you again soon.